Well, I'm Sam Love. I'm originally from Aliceville, Alabama, where the prisoner of war camp, one of the prisoner of war camps, was located. And so I grew up around it. The Officers Club was still in existence, not as an officers club, but as like a community recreation center. So we used to have high school dances in the old Officers Club, but I didn't know that much about the history of it. I was aware that they had POWs from World War II, but I thought maybe they were Japanese and Germans. But what happened is that at some point, a book of pictures from one of the officers who had been at the camp was sent to the local library. About, I would guess, the pictures came in about 1998. When they started developing this. And what happened is one of the officers, who I think had been the commanding officer of the camp in Aliceville, passed away. And his daughter was cleaning out his effects and found an album of these pictures of the German POWs doing cultural events, theatrical performances, sporting events, working with clay, topiary, cooking classes, literature classes, English classes. And so she just literally packed this album up and sent it to the library in Aliceville. And when they got it, it was an eye-opener. The librarian shared them with me, and I got really intrigued. And they started talking about wanting to put this museum together and collect artifacts and all that. What intrigued me most about this camp is that they had very humane treatment. The more that I learned about it, I was just astounded that during World War II, with all the brutality that existed in World War II, and we know now what was happening with Jewish, prisoners in the death camps and all that, that you could have a camp, mostly of non-commissioned officers and officers, that under the Geneva Convention, they did not have to work. So they basically turned this camp into an art colony in the middle of World War II. And that was astounding to me. I mean, I've been involved in the peace movement in the past, during the Vietnam War days. And so I just had never heard of anything like this. And of course, the more I started reading about it, the more I realized that the Geneva Convention actually set certain standards for the amount of food the prisoners had to have, and the kind of conduct. They had a choice of either working or not working. They had to be paid a certain amount. And, I've read that one of the reasons that the POWs were treated so well here is that there was hopes that the Germans were going to also abide by the Geneva Convention. Now, what's really interesting about the Geneva Convention is that's between states. And so what's going on now in the Middle East is like non-state actors. And so they're not signatories to the Geneva Convention. And of course, it's just horrible what's happening there. They decided to have a reunion in Aliceville of former POWs and some of the guards. And so there was an effort made to reach out to them. And what happened is that I decided to tape interviews working with Mary Beth Paluzzi, who was very interested in this subject. She's a librarian and became the director of the museum at one point that they developed in Alabama. And so she and I conducted these interviews, which became the basis for the documentary. Well, I think the first thing that has to be understood is that in World War I, there were a lot of Germans who were apprehended and put in camps, similar to what happened with the Japanese. But I think that the real difference is that with World War II, once certain armies really collapsed, like the first group sent to Aliceville were from Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was one of the first large campaigns where the Germans had a major defeat. The British said, we don't have room for these thousands of prisoners. And so the Americans agreed to take them. And we had these Liberty ships that were taking supplies over to Germany, to Europe for our troops, and they were coming back empty. And so there was a deal worked out where basically the prisoners were put on the Liberty ships and sent back. They were sent to New York City and then put on trains. They located these camps in the heartland, in the South, in the Midwest, and Aliceville was one of the larger ones. What's also unique about Aliceville is that it was a camp for non-commissioned officers and officers. And under the Geneva Convention, they did not have to work. Some did, and they were paid for it. But if they didn't want to work, they could take classes, they could do sculpture, they could do painting, sports events, all of that. And I mean, it's terrible what happened with the Japanese, but I think that, the emotional response to Pearl Harbor, and just that there was this fear that you were going to have sleeper cells of Japanese attacking military installations and all that. And there was the same kind of fear with the Germans in World War I. But I haven't seen as much evidence of that in World War II. And I don't think that fairly answers your question, because there isn't an easy answer to it.
Another thing that I have found striking in learning more about this history is that so few people know about it. I mean, you lived in Aliceville and you didn't even learn about it until later in life. And that's brought up a lot for me about how history is passed down. And obviously World War II is a pretty dense topic that we learn about in schools. And I'm wondering your opinion on why this history is lesser known.
Well, let's get this out. There were thousands, I've seen figures close to 400,000 prisoners that were German prisoners of war that were held in the United States. And Aliceville at some point had as many as 6,000. It was one of the largest camps. So you get some idea. But I've also read that the camps that did interrogations of the officers and some of the German scientists, the interrogation records were destroyed at the end of the war. So there isn't that good of a historical record of what happened. And of course, the military intelligence was very interested in what the Germans were doing to develop an atomic bomb. Right. And so, you had Wernher von Braun, who was doing the V-2 missile, later became very active in the space program, scientists that played a role in, the development of the technology for the atomic bomb that was dropped on the Japanese.
Right. Do you know if this is something that children in Aliceville learn about now? I mean, I know the museum is there, but is this something that's taught?
Well, I know that school groups do tours of the museum because there are a number of artifacts. There's some of the a lot of the sculptures were done with concrete. And they've got some of the uniforms and display cases. They've got, artifacts, some of the camp newspapers. There was a newspaper printed that did poetry and literary essays, and some of that was there. An example of the sort of absurdity of this situation is that in the middle of World War II, Hitler sent a contribution through the Red Cross to Aliceville, Alabama, to mount an art exhibit for the public of the prisoners' artwork.
Right.
That's
crazy.
Well, we have to put in perspective. There was a group of prisoners that were segregated from the general population who were ardent Nazis. And they actually killed some of the prisoners that they thought were becoming too friendly with the Americans, because the prisoners could leave the camp and go out and work on farms. They even did some yard work around town. Right. And so, there was a hardcore Nazi group. They had a celebration of Hitler's birthday during the camp and things like that. And so, it wasn't for everybody, it wasn't a pleasant experience. One of the things that struck me is that some of the POWs, and I think all of them that we talked to now have passed away, they said they considered themselves lucky to have been captured early in the war, so they didn't have to fight on the Russian front and be captured by the Russians, that they were really happy to be able to get adequate food when they were hearing stories at home of food rationing and challenges, because we were bombing the rail networks in Germany.
Right.
And then the other thing that has to be understood is that some of the American POWs that were held in Germany, maybe they were shot down with aircraft crews or captured, have bitter experiences about their captivity in Germany. And so they, in many ways, resent the fact that there was such good treatment of the prisoners in camps like Aliceville. And, you know, the Army just, I think, generally agreed that if we treat them well, they'll treat our prisoners well. Stories have come out that that's not necessarily true. And one other thing, I think the real lesson from this is that there were friendships that actually developed, which people corresponded for years between some of the Americans in town, some of the guards, and the POWs. And then there have been several reunions, I mean, not now, but in the early 2000s of these, and I was with them, and they were really friendly toward each other, and you didn't get the feeling that they were out for revenge. I think right now, with what's going on in the Middle East, there's so much blood that's been let, is that even when some of these areas are captured, the revenge killings may just be starting, and it's just a horrible situation. Well, the only thing that I really can add is I hope that we will learn a lesson from this about humane treatments of our adversaries.
Well, I thank you so much for talking with me. And
thank you for doing this. I'm sorry I can't be there for your dance.
No worries.
Looks quite interesting.